Good morning, Congressman. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you and the audience.
Yes. Now, I don't know if you all know the Congressman's wife is a nurse practitioner, so I'm guessing the subject comes up once or twice, high drug prices, in your conversation.
Well, certainly the whole concept of how people are using drugs is a part of our conversation. I talk about it more, she talks about it more in the concept of education and adherence, because in addition to being a nursing professor now, and she teaches in a broad concept of, we educating children, so she has a second job in which she continues to do community-based nursing and goes into the homes of patients oftentimes after they've been discharged. There's a great deal of education associated with people understanding the meds that they're on, having the family support that, but also having the patient appreciate that adherence to that regimen is so critical to staving off a rehospitalization. And that's where the costs are. That's where the enormous, in addition to those who don't abide by the drugs that are prescribed, because if you don't have a baseline, you can't make adjustments, you can't determine whether something is working or not working, and we lose all of that valuable time, oftentimes at the most critical stage when somebody's just finished a hospitalization and they're still really in probably today a rather medically unstable position.
Talking healthcare costs, let's talk healthcare reform. Obviously, last week, Republicans weren't really able to get the support that they needed to push forward the Graham-Cassidy bill and the repealing of Obamacare. Some are saying it's really become obvious now that you're not going to be able to move healthcare reform forward without Democrats and Republicans collaborating and cooperating. Do you think that's possible? And if it is, how is that going to impact the cost of prescription drugs for Americans?
I think that's a good question. Right now, we're still in, okay, what's next? And I think as we are working on tax reform, it's not going to be the immediate bounce to what's next. And we're watching to see what Alexander and Mary do in the Senate to see if there's a next play in healthcare in the short run. But regardless of what may come in, and I think there's going to have to be something to fill that void, because we're still left with uncertainty with things like risk corridor sharing and things of that nature. We're going to have to resolve some of those questions. That's where the opportunity comes to begin to look at other kinds of saving things. There's going to be movement on the parts of my colleagues to deal with the drug on, the medical device tax, things of that nature. But it's a space in which one of the issues that I'm working on, which is to try to move away from the fee-for-service mechanism, not just in healthcare delivery generally, but also tying some of the great things that are helping in overall care and making sure that the pharmaceutical section participates in that as well.
Now, are you talking now about, it sounds like, values-based pricing?
Very much so.
Explain to us what that is, and who do you think would benefit if we start to go in that direction with pharmaceuticals?
Well, value-based pricing changes the care model, one in which we're looking to take advantage of outcomes as opposed to payment per pill. And it works not just, it's value versus volume. And it anticipates that there may be certain costs associated with that, but our overall goal is to look down the road and see what the costs are to non-adherence or the unavailability of certain kind of breakthrough drugs, which can change outcomes. And so we're looking at a situation in which if we can find ways to deliver drugs that work on individuals, especially as we start moving towards specialized medicine, we're going to hold down overall costs to the system, in addition to patient suffering. I mean, these are things in which the breakthroughs, as well as adherence to those which are currently available, are things in which we can make great inroads. But there's impediments to that, like the kickback laws and things that I'm working on trying to get around.
Do you think that the 115th Congress is the one that's going to be able to act on drug pricing reform? Because that does seem to be an area where there is more bipartisan support. And Senator Klobuchar was just here on stage earlier this morning saying, we have to change. I mean, now is the time. I'd
love to say yes. There's a lot on the plate right now with tax reform and
Not
infrastructure and
optimistic,
other
though.
kinds of issues. I just got to be realistic about what is going. My wife has a saying, and I think this is what we need to look at. Everybody's looking for the instant fix on healthcare. That, okay, we got this plan tomorrow, it's going to be fixed and on, we're going to go. And my wife laughs at me and she goes, you know, it took us 20 years to get into this. It's going to take us as long to get this right. We've got to continue to work at it piece by piece. And that's why I'm so focused on trying to support the ability for the delivery of innovative new drug therapies to patients that can benefit from them and find the mechanisms to deliver that in a way that moves us to you know, a more, not just more effective, but a more cost-effective way to do it.
But still, it's got to be frustrating to go piece by piece, take this deliberate approach, because you yourself, I mean, one of the causes that's near and dear to you in Pennsylvania is combating the opioid epidemic, and you have seen drugs like naloxone going up, what, 17 times in price over the past 2 years. People who need that medication can't wait. And well, why do you think that's happening? Just taking a look at naloxone, because it is a generic available in multiple varieties, and generally that means the price comes down. What's happening there?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously you would suspect that there might be some matter of just competition for it, in the sense that it's now everywhere. I mean, you know, policemen are carrying it in their cars. Individuals are now keeping it at home. So some element of demand. But I have to think that there's also a recognition whenever you get in. I haven't studied it close enough. We've really worked more on trying to assure that those who are in a position to be able to deliver it, you know, have it, so that we expand the number of people who can make it available for those in need.
Let's talk about the FDA. In the past, the FDA has really focused on drug efficacy, drug safety, and now we have a new FDA commissioner, Commissioner Gottlieb, who has been very vocal and very activist about pharmaceutical pricing and, for instance, promoting the creation of more generic drugs via the Drug Competition Action Plan. What do you think about that? How is he working with Congress?
Well, I think Scott Gottlieb's doing a great job in terms of really sitting back and looking and thinking, how can I approach the system of delivering drugs to individuals where it can make a difference? I think he's looking at two ways. I think he's looking at it to assure that they break down the prohibitions that have been, whether somebody's been gaming the system or otherwise influencing the ability to challenge existing drugs once they go off patent. You know, making sure that the drugs available to be compared, to be tested. So Gottlieb's looking at those kinds of things which may be done, which are delaying the process, the pay for delay, challenging whether or not once something's on, you know, off patent, that it's going to continue to be manipulated in a way that the generic doesn't get on the market. So that's sort of going against the negatives of the system, but is also working simultaneously on trying to expand the communication that takes place, where we've got drugs that are not yet FDA approved, but there's a lot of information out there about things that are being done, either off-label or otherwise, and trying to, also in accordance with some of the great work that was done by Fred Upton in the last Congress with the 21st Century Cures, in which we're trying to expand the availability of information that will help people developing generics.
Let's talk about the head of another agency. Some say that the head of Health and Human Services, the secretary, ought to be able to negotiate drug prices like the head of the VA does. What would be wrong with that?
I think the HHS director's got a lot on their plate, and one more responsibility like that may be sound good on paper, but in my mind, this is probably left best to those that are in the position to really negotiate effectively.
And who would that be?
Well, I think that you're seeing drug plans and otherwise, you know, doing a pretty good job. They understand
PBMs?
the market. Well, PBMs are included in there. They certainly understand the market. The best of anybody. They can work on volume. They can work on other kinds of incentives, and I'm working to try to change that to enable a lot more collaboration and to clear the prohibitions from the anti-kickback statutes, the Stark laws, and things of that nature. We also have seen something where the VA does negotiate prices, but when I talk to some of the VA folks, you get lower prices in some spaces, but you also get reduced availability. And as we're working towards more specialized medicine, and we're looking at the next level of breakthrough drugs, I mean, I think is 50% of the new drug development is going to be in specialty drugs. And we oftentimes talk about this as one great big system, not recognizing great progress has been made with generics and other kinds of competition. $1.7 trillion saved from was estimated by virtue of introducing generics into the markets. Part D has turned out to be better. But we're also looking at most of the innovation now taking place, 30% for cancer. Great that we're moving into this. We're looking into things like gene therapy and other brand new ways to attack illness that are really, really exciting, some of it expensive. So, we don't want to not make that available to those who could benefit from it. So I think that sometimes that sounds good on paper. I'm not so sure with all the HHS has on its plate that that's the best use of their time.
The president himself has really used the bully pulpit on the subject of prescription drugs. He's tweeted about them. He's talked about drafting an executive order. He's also spoken out at rallies talking about the outrageous cost of prescription drugs. And there are some actually who are now crediting him for when this year, several different times when different pharmaceutical companies, Sanofi, Regeneron, and Roche, have unveiled new breakthrough drugs, they have actually unveiled them at a lower price than their competitors are offering. And some are saying, maybe that's because they are concerned about government intervention. I mean, when you see that kind of thing happening, do you think that's what's happening? Is it because of the president? Is it because of that pressure? And if so, I mean, does it make you go, darn, we should have gotten tough with them a long time ago ourselves?
Well, the bully pulpit can be a good thing, and I suspect that it certainly, there's a causal relationship. Whether it's 100%, I don't know, but the president's focus on this has certainly caused a lot of those in the industry to think about the long-term implications or even the short-term of what it would be to, be in his scope. It's a very powerful issue that resonates with constituents all across the country. I hear it almost regularly. I hear two things: property taxes and the cost of drugs, particularly among my senior population. So he struck a chord, and I think him focusing on this is probably, I thought for 1 year, to my understanding, the cost of drugs sort of flattened for a year. Now there's been a small uptick of 1 or 2% in the last in the last 6 months, but I think the bully pulpit works.
Do you think, though, it is hard for members of Congress to get tough with drug companies when, it's an open secret that they contribute more to lawmakers than any other industry?
Let me respond.
The number is, with Center for Responsive Politics, $3.6 billion over the last 20 years. It doesn't affect you?
I get inspired by looking at the opportunity to do this job and to say, if I leave, what's a legacy going to be? And if I can have an impact, as small as it may be, in changing the way, in a more positive way that healthcare is delivered, that's going to help people. That's why most of my colleagues are here, even though we may disagree from both sides. And to be honest, I don't pay any attention to who is contributing with respect to the decisions you make, nor do I think most of my colleagues on the other side really do. And these campaigns are so expensive that you might think a $5,000 contribution means a lot, and it does, but not when you have a $3.5 million primary.
Mm-hmm. As a House Republican, how do you balance the need to reduce costs and then at the same time increase private sector market-based reforms? What is the balance between spending and innovation in your mind?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of R&D that's taking place right now, and you want to reward the ability for them to take that into the marketplace. We're working on trying to enable collaboration to break down some of the barriers that had prevented the willingness for the companies to look at, take the risk that if by collaborating with physicians in discussing ways in which they could give information or support systems. Again, I go back to adherence. 30% of the drugs are never even picked up that are prescribed, that are at a pharmacy. 50% of the drugs are not adhered to in the designed way. So if we can work on ways in which we can collaborate on value-based so that the outcomes are what drives the pricing, then you've got incentives for people to continue to make that adherence a part of the regimen. A lot more education, a lot more follow-up, and then the drugs work. And I think that's one of the ways in which we can not only reduce drug prices, but we can also find innovative ways to begin to pay for what are expensive new therapies. These one-time drugs that are going to cost, tens, sometimes even hundreds of thousands of dollars. How can you make it available for a life-changing thing, but a big upfront cost? And there may be innovative ways we can do that through this collaboration.
Speaking of innovative ways, you do have a number of different pieces of legislation in the hopper that could address this. Of those we haven't talked about, which do you think you'd like to share with the audience about? Do you think really have promise right now?
Yeah, well, I did mention. I think the thing that has the most promise is the Stark and anti-kickback laws, which effectively police what are perceived to be self-dealing. I was a former federal prosecutor. I prosecuted these cases. I know when there are cases in which people are trying to manipulate the system.
Against drug companies?
Against drug companies, yeah.
With success.
We had some of the biggest settlements in the history of the, against some of the major drug companies, but I also appreciate that the collaboration in which they may be able to use systems to communicate with patients is now prevented. And if we get into these value-based, then it's not volume-based. We're not getting paid per pill. We're getting paid to see if this therapy can work and hold down what are subsequent cost to the system if somebody, instead of getting better, gets sick and gets rehospitalized. So we want to incent that collaboration, and we want to create safe harbors so that if people accord with the elements of this kind of an agreement, they're not afraid that just simply if one purpose of this collaboration is deemed to be a violation of the kickback statute, they can get huge penalties. And we want to get that risk pulled away from the willingness of people to work together, because the future of healthcare is going to be collaboration from the delivery persons, from those who have the devices and drugs, and frankly, those who are the recipients and their families understanding what's happening to them and how to make smart choices. But I think adherence is also a critically important part. How to make sure they stay with that which has been prescribed for them to get better.
We'll go to audience questions in just a minute, so folks will get your thinking caps on, whatever you'd like to ask the Congressman. It was interesting that you mentioned you'd had success in prosecuting pharmaceutical companies over their drug pricing back when you were a prosecutor. Is it at all frustrating ever? Do you feel like you had more success going after them then and bringing down prices than you have as a lawmaker on the Hill?
Well, I would suspect so, because I was one person and I could more directly impact things. When you're part of 400 and plus, it's not as easy. What we did was enforce best price violations so that we're able to make sure that there wasn't profiteering based on, among many other things, but best price was one of the major cases we did against one of the major drug companies. There's a lot of other factors that I think are more effective that we can be doing, and I've talked about a couple today to help drive down the costs.
All right, well, let's go to audience questions. Where are mic runners? Here we go, got one back here.
Hi, my name is Meredith Basie. I'm the Executive Director for Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, and I have one question for you. Senator, the United States is one of the few developed countries in the world that doesn't regulate prices. So what are your barriers, given that the NIH invests $34 billion of US taxpayer funds every year to the most risky R&D, and yet the US pays prices like $129,000 for a prostate cancer drug, where across the border in Canada, that very same drug that was 100% funded by the taxpayer is $29,000.
Well, thank you for the promotion to the Senate, although I'm not so sure that that is, in this day and age, I'm not even sure that's better. Look, you asked a question about R&D, and I think you've got to invest. These are hugely difficult things to find new therapies that are going to make a difference. And a lot of the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. And as we moved towards more specialized medicine delivery, greater understanding with the ability of computers to analyze broad amounts of data and other sorts of things, we have remarkable capacity to find new ways to make people better. You talked about the fact that America subsidizes a lot of the R&D and other countries benefit. You know, there's ways in which some people suggest you're going to be able to, you know, they're circumventing the system when they're taking drugs from Canada and across the seas and bringing them back in. We have to deal straight on with the question of how you get value associated with those who invest money in the R&D, and then how they price it. And it may include a calculation of how much R&D they put in, you know, associated with price. It may look at outcomes. I just did something with genes. We've got a great new group in we call it Silicon Valley in Philadelphia, where I am from, and some of the remarkable new things that they are doing. One treatment can cure blindness in a child. So what's the cost associated with a lifetime of sight? How do you price that? We've got to find innovative ways to do that, but I think we need to work directly on that. And
another question. Where's our mic runner here?
Steve Knievel from Public Citizen. Congressman, thank you for giving us your time today. So Kaiser Health News polling has consistently shown that Americans across the party spectrum, Republicans, Independents, Democrats, pretty much consistent across the board, support at 92%, allowing the Secretary to negotiate Part D drug prices. You clearly disagree. What would you say to the more than 9 of 10 of your constituents that think that we should allow HHS to use its negotiating power because it's the largest buyer of prescription drugs in the world?
I think I answered that. I mean, I think I answered that question earlier when it was raised. I'm not so sure. In the end, we've seen what the Veterans Administration does. We see what HHS has on its plate right now with its responsibilities to oversee the timeliness and effectiveness of getting drugs to market. Adding that whole new responsibility may or may not be a better outcome than what is currently being done, in which market-based forces are driving a lot of this down. $1.7 trillion saved. Medicare Part D far below what was expected. We're having huge outcomes on most drugs that are being delivered to people. We're looking at a segment now in which the real growth, not across the board, I know that there's incremental raising in numbers of drugs, but the real growth in drug pricing is in the innovative new delivery mechanisms, which are related back to R&D. So, you know, this sounds good in theory, but I'm not sure creating a whole new bureaucracy is going to supplant that which is you know, more effectively done. The plans are pretty sophisticated, and they understand the market forces more than an HHS technocrat's going to be, because I'm going to tell you the second factor. When you have somebody who's part of a private sector system and a plan and others, and they're there and they work their way through, you get government agencies. People spend 3 years, they get their chops, and then they get recruited and they leave, and a whole new group is coming in. There's constant turnover, and I don't think that there is the bandwidth to be able to do that as effectively as it's happening.
All right, another question. We got someone over here.
Julie Kanter Weinberg with Prime Therapeutics. Thanks so much for being here. We're a PBM. I think we now have the Part D program dating all the way back to 2003. So we have so many members of Congress that weren't here then. How do we get the word out about how successful a program that's been? I think you understand that, but not enough of your colleagues do.
I think that people communicate in a lot of ways. I think that should be one of the things when you consider your advertising budgets, you factor that in. These are sophisticated issues, and I don't know that you should be relying on Congress to deliver that message per se. There's just too many things on people's plates and too many areas where people need to be focused, where they're specializing in, and they rely on others for help in these kinds of issues. But it's a good story. It should be told, because I don't think people appreciate how much progress has been made through Medicare Part D in terms of what it was anticipated to cost.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you all for your questions, for your attention. Thank you, Congressman Meehan.
Thank you, Kath.
Appreciate
Great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.